our presenters. As you well know, Stephen King needs no introduction, but I will leave that introduction, that honor and privilege to our Professor Galgan. Before I introduce Professor Galgan, however, I'd like to share with you that all of us at St. Joseph's College are especially thankful to Stephen and Tabitha King for their generous support to St. Joseph's College over the years. Their foundation has supported our library and now our new Center for Nursing Innovation. And now to introduce Wendy Galgan. Dr. Galgan is Chair and Professor of English at St. Joseph's College. She's formerly Chair and Tenured Associate Professor of English at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, New York. Dr. Galgan has a diverse academic areas of interest, including women's poetry, war literature, pop culture genres, of horror, detective, science fiction, and she is a published poet. She's the editor of ACC, an online journal of arts and letters, and she has taught numerous courses on King's work, both online and on campus, from introductory level to senior seminar. And what might interest all of you that you don't know is that at the age of 16, Wendy, who was a soda junkie back then, visited Porter's drugstore in Booth Bay Harbor. There, Stephen King, a friend of the owners, had come along for a book signing. It was then that Stephen had spent about a half hour talking to Wendy and encouraged her to pursue her own writing goals. And she has brought all of that to her career at St. Joseph's College. That conversation was one of the transitional moments in her life that has brought her to be a great teacher and a poet today. So Wendy, thank you so much for inviting Stephen to join us. And if you could please kindly make your remarks and your presentation and introductions.
Thank you, Joanne, and welcome everyone. So glad to see you all, even if it is only on Zoom. Okay, so the phrase master storyteller is often used to describe Stephen King, and with very good reason. Above all else, King always tells a good story, a story that draws you in, that makes you think, that enlightens you, while it entertains you as well. In order to tell stories that do all that, King also needs to be and is an excellent writer. In his Washington Post review of King's latest book, Later, Stephen Graham Jones, you notice I look down because I can't remember names, says that King's writing is, quote, as clean, direct, and evocative as it's ever been, unquote. These seem to be simple words, but they describe a complex, difficult ability that King possesses to write well, to write straightforwardly and honestly, and to write from the heart as well as the head. When introducing an author like Stephen King, you could talk about facts. For example, he's written more than 60 novels, more than 200 short stories, as well as nonfiction works, such as Dance Macabre and On Writing, which I use for my students. Worldwide, he's sold, last thing I saw was 350 million copies of his books. It's probably more than that now. And he's received numerous awards, including the National Medal of Arts and the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. And these facts are important, but more important to me is King's work itself, specifically the stories he tells. King once said that genres such as horror or mystery, quote, make a writer tell a real story, unquote. And that is true as far as it goes. But once you begin reading King's work, you come to understand that he would tell a real story, no matter what genre he's writing in. It's in his nature to be a storyteller. This isn't surprising for someone from Maine. I see it in my own students, who even when they're writing an academic paper, know how to draw the reader in with narrative. So in some ways, then, King is the inheritor of Maine storytelling tradition, where we all sit around the dinner table or by the campfire and tell stories. That he does this so well, that he brings the reader into a world that is both everyday and extraordinary, is a talent and skill of his own making. And we are very lucky that he shares so much of that talent and skill with us. And I am very lucky to be able to say to Stephen King, welcome to St. Joseph's front row with the faculty.
It's nice to be here. Thank you. What a nice introduction.
Oh, heartfelt. So I thought, because I have a lot of our creative writing students here listening, and I know other writers are listening, thought we could start out with a process question and then go on from there. So I had to write these down because they have titles in them, and I'm terrible with titles as I'm terrible with names. So your work often contains literary allusions, as well as artistic and musical ones. And you've talked about how literary work will become part of the inspiration for story like Bradbury's The Veldt and The Shining. But there are some works that are at least in part homages to or retellings of poems or novellas or stories that came before. I'm thinking of things like Browning's Childe Roland of the Dark Tower Came, and the Gunslinger novels, and the Lord of the Rings and The Stand, and The End of the Whole Mess, and Flowers for Algernon. So in those instances where it's an homage or a retelling, do you sit down with the intention of retelling a particular story? Or do you first have an idea for a story and then say, oh, hey, I could use Flowers for Algernon as an inspiration? And could you talk a little bit about the process of using one work as the basis for another, what that's like, and how it differs from like maybe writing from scratch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, for instance, with Salem's Lot, originally it was called Second Coming because it was I wanted to use the Dracula story, which I think is one of the great popular novels of the 19th century. And what interested me about Dracula, I don't always have a hobby horse to ride when I go in, but sometimes I do. Once in a while I do. I did with Under the Dome. That was around the time of Bush and the Iraq War. But with Second Coming, and by the way, my wife told me you can't call it that. You have to change the name because it sounds like a sex manual. So I uh, I ended up calling it Jerusalem's Lot, and then the publisher shortened it to Salem's Lot. But one of the things that's interesting about Dracula is that it came along at a time in the 1890s, around the turn of the 20th century, when everyone was entranced with technology. Everybody just loved the idea that everything was going to change and we were on the verge of a brand new world where things were going to be beautiful and things were going to be wonderful. So that there's detective work that takes place there. Dr. Seward keeps a phonograph diary, which is the precursor of tapes or the thing on your phone where you have a recording thing, little wax discs. But at the time, it was the height of technology. There's the use of magnifying glasses, and the bottom line is this. There's a feeling in that book, a subtext in Dracula, where you say to yourself, well, Count Dracula made a terrible mistake in coming to London because he's a creature of the supernatural, a creature of the old times, and he's come to this modern city, and they're going to hound him to his death. So all those years later, in 1975 or whenever I wrote it, I thought to myself, this is where technology has gotten us. We're in a box. We're in a mess. We have enough nuclear weapons to blow up the entire world. And now, we've gone even further where we live in this age of Zoom and computers, and in a pandemic, it's wonderful, but you ask anybody who's been burned on social media, and they'll tell you, that it can be, the advent of the new Puritanism where everybody comes after you. So when I wrote Salem's Lot, I thought, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to use Dracula and I'm going to bounce it. I'm going to bounce my book off Dracula like a handball player and see what happens. And I thought it was fantastic fun. But with The Dark Tower, I read the Browning poem in college, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. And I had no idea what it was about or what it meant. But I can still remember it. Right now, you can't see me. Maybe it's the after effects of my last Moderna shot, but I'm goosebumps all over when I think about that last line, you know, Child Roland blew his horn and Child Roland to the Dark Tower came. And I thought, what if I sort of combine like the Western genre with a kind of a fantasy world that's fallen to ruin, and everything is run by this dark tower at the center of it all. And if it falls, uh, everything falls to chaos. I had no more idea about it than that, and I sat down. I wrote a line. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed, and everything came from there. So sometimes, you know, that happens, and everything is grist for the mill. Everything
Yeah.
you read, everything that you see in the movies or on TV, it all, you know, writers have a junk heap in their mind. We're like magpies. You look for what's bright and shining.
Yeah. That's my favorite opening line of all your books, I think. That,
You're not
I have to
alone.
say.
You know, I just
I have
wrote
to
it
say.
I wrote it in a cabin in Orono, Maine, and I had no idea.
Yeah,
I
yeah, no,
remember the time, but
wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you. So now I'm going to kind of switch gears. My students are used to this with me. I try to keep them on their toes a little bit by switching gears. So I'm going to move to process a little bit. So I'd like to get into content. And in just about all of the stories that you tell, one or more characters have to make a stand, right? Sometimes they're smaller, more personal stands, like Chris Chambers pulling the gun in the body, or Bill Hodges and ultimately Holly Gibney in Mr. Mercedes. And sometimes the fate of the world, or at least a larger part of it, depends on people making a stand, like the Losers Club in it, or Ralph and Larry and Glenn in the Stand. So I have a two-part question. First, is the idea of making a stand one that you have consciously examined in your work? Do you sit down with that in your mind, or is it more a function of the fact that you're very often talking about the battle between good and evil in all its permutations? And the second part is, over the course of your career, have you found your understanding of good and evil has changed, particularly when it comes to human nature?
boy, those are big topics.
I know.
The only time that I consciously worked with the idea of making a stand was in The Stand. And I don't think that I even had a title for that book when I started writing it. It was just the untitled novel that kept growing and growing and growing. And I think that probably my Methodist upbringing, you know, church every Sunday and Thursday night school every Thursday night, and Bible readings and all that all played a part in it, because they, I wanted to write a book that sort of expressed the whole idea of Christian martyrdom and standing up for what you believe in, even when things are at their darkest. I wanted very consciously to use that in the book. But the other thing, in a lot of these stories, like Dale Barbie in Under the Dome, he's just basically this drifter who comes into the town at the time that this thing happens. In Needful Things, there's a sheriff who is just basically your small town sheriff. I could go on. There are other characters with the same thing, but ordinary people. That's what interests me. Ordinary, regular people. And I don't use the word ordinary in any pejorative sense at all. I just mean people who just are good people. And I feel in my life that most of the people that I've met are good people. Every now and then you meet somebody who is an exception to the rule. But most people are good. Most people go to work. They do their job. They love their family. They take care of people. What interests me is what happens when one of those good people finds themselves in a position that is entirely extraordinary. I like stories about ordinary people in extraordinary situations. And really, the best example, the purest example of that is, and keep in mind that what you said in your introduction, I want to tell stories. That's what really interests me. I want for readers to enjoy the story. In fact, I would like the words to disappear and have them just sort of slip through into the dimension of the story. But I wrote a story called The Mist, and it was about ordinary people, regular people in a Maine community. I think that I gave it a name, but it was Bridgeton, basically, Bridgeton, Maine. And at that time, there was a supermarket there, and I used to shop there. And one day there was a terrible storm, and we went in, and my son and I went in. He was just little, and the power was off, the generator didn't work, and they were making change for people out of the tills. The tills were open, and they were just making change and handwriting receipts and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, what would it be like if there were this huge mist came in and there were monsters, like B-movie monsters with tentacles and great big horrible jaws and flying things like pterodactyls? What would it be like? What would they do? And so I populated the market with what I thought of as a cross-section of people. And I had a main character who was the vehicle for the story to be told. And so when it comes to making a stand, some people do stand up and some people don't. Simple as that. We see it in our daily lives. We see it in situations that are national, that are international. We see people who stand and people who kind of like just say, I'm going to slide by.
You mentioned The Mist. I just have to tell you, my students want me to particularly thank you for scaring the jeeps out of them with that story, because I had it, I usually teach it, and we read it one day, and a number of them who were commuter students emailed me and said, I couldn't go to class the next day. I was late because it was so foggy and I didn't dare walk to my car. And I said, I thought you'd be pleased to hear that.
I am pleased. I am pleased. I like to scare people, but I also like to make people laugh. And I wouldn't mind, if you squirted a tear or two, actually. I'm an emotional writer in a lot of ways. I'm not particularly intellectual, and I'm not what you'd call a rationalist. I guess if you called me any ist, it would be a naturalist, because I want to paint pictures that are realistic, and yet at the same time I want to introduce that element of the bizarre. I think it helps people to look at their real lives when they do that. So yeah, I'm happy if if people are scared. I mean, if that makes me a bad guy, it makes me a bad guy.
No, it doesn't. I like to sit in the back and watch them watch film adaptations of your work in the class, because I know when the jumps are coming, and they literally come up out of their seat, Where they, with The Mist though, where they found, you're talking about emotions, where they all connected was with Billy. Mm-hmm. They were like, and you could watch when they were watching the film, the same thing. They would Carmody gets shot or whatever happens and somebody gets killed, that's fine. But when the boy was in danger, they were moving and you get that emotional response from.
It's funny how people react, because in The Dead Zone, which is one of the early books, a lot of horrible things happen in the course of that book. They happen to Johnny Smith. There's a killer who wears a slick raincoat, and he's killed a number of people. So awful things happen. But I got, oy vey, so many letters about the very beginning of that book, when Greg Stilson kicks a dog to death in the yard. And I heard about that from a lot of people. If there had been, social media at that time, I would have been totally flamed. And then in Cujo, everybody kind of related to the dog. He was a good dog, I agree with that, but he was also dangerous. So
Yeah.
people like dogs, people like little kids, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, and I think the work you do, everybody can find a character to relate to. I mean, my mom does not like horror stories, but when I talked about, she's an English teacher, she was. And so I said, I was going to ask you about characters taking a stand. The first one she came up with, like the mother in Cujo. And
Yeah.
so people can find, my students in particular can find somebody that they can relate to.
Did you show your class that movie? Cujo?
Yes. And then we read the ending of the book, and they wept. They cried. They were like,
well, I remember getting together with the people. At that time, there was a company called Sun International, and they made the movie. And my wife and I were in New York, and three of the producers came to see me, and I could tell they were really nervous. And they said, "What would you think if the little boy lived at the end of the movie?" And I said, "Really, I think movie audiences coast to coast would lynch you if he died." Movies are somehow a little more immediate than books are. There's something about them. For instance, I can write in a book that somebody got a hypodermic needle in the eye, and you kind of go, like that, and then you go on. But if you show somebody getting a hypodermic needle in the eye, 90% of the audience is going to go like that and hide their face. And anyway, I felt like with Cujo the movie that probably the little boy died even more horribly because the dog licked his face after he'd had the rabies virus. So
yeah. I'm glad you said that, because I was going to bring up, there was I've been trolling YouTube. There was a 1980 Dick Cavett show with you and George Romero and Ira Levin and Peter Straub.
Yeah.
And Romero talked about the startle. And he said, in my films, I can do a startle. And Cavett asked you guys, can you ever do it in a book? And you mentioned a specific example of the hand coming up in Carrie, right? But you never really answered the question completely. So can you do a startle? Can you startle someone in a book at all?
I think you can. I think you can get to a point in a book where you say, "My God, I can't believe that was going to happen." And I can give one example. I don't know if I want to spoil it or not, but I actually got a letter from Harlan Coben, who's a mystery writer.
Yeah.
Said he had read a copy of The Outsider, and he said, "I can't believe you did that. I just it just flattened me because there's someone you think is the main character of that story that's going to be, he's been falsely accused of murdering a little boy, and you expect him to go through the entire book and either be exonerated or be proved. And instead, early on, a guy comes out of the crowd and shoots him dead. So there's that. And I was going to mention one other thing, and it slipped my mind entirely. So I guess we better move on.
Well, I'll tell you the new book, no spoiler, I will not get a spoiler later, which I devoured in like one setting. I loved it. I didn't see the twist coming. And I usually do, because I teach this and read it all the time. And that's what made me think of the startle question, because I literally like, what the, when I read it.
I love a story where everything at the end turns everything on its head, but you have to be able to say after that happens, it was logical, because if he just pulls it out of his hat, no, I don't like that. Work. But for instance, there's a book by Agatha Christie called "And Then There Were None," and the ending of that book is a startle. And then there's one called "The Murder of Roger Ackroyd," where the ending of that book, I defy anyone to see it coming, and yet it's perfect. It's classic.
I had a student email me when I assigned the Ackroyd book. And like, I can't tell you anything about it. You have to read it. She kept emailing me, like, after she finished each chapter, I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get it. Then she gets there and she goes, oh, now I get it. Right. So speaking
about it, when you talk about an actual startle, in a book, you can't do, for instance, what Hitchcock does in Psycho, when Janet Leigh is in the shower And I think we know that something bad is going to happen to her the first time that you see it. But there's a combination of elements that go on there. There's the rapid cutting between
Mm.
the killer and the knife and her and the blood going down the drain. But there's also Bernard Herrmann's score, you know, with
Yeah.
those squealing violins. It
Mm.
makes a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of your new book, you want to tell us a little about it? As I said, I loved
Well,
it.
it's a book about a little boy who's a medium. That is to say, he can see dead people and he can talk to dead people. And the New York Times review referenced The Sixth Sense, which I referenced in the book because for two reasons. Jamie would know about it.
Mm.
Jamie's the main character, and also because I wanted people to know that I know about it. At that point, the stories go in two different directions. And my story, actually, what I was thinking of, you were talking about literary references and, you know, the way that they play a part. There's a story by D.H. Lawrence called The Rocking Horse Winter. And
Yeah.
that's a story about a little boy who is Jamie Conklin's age, who has a precognitive ability. He can predict the winners of horse races. And his parents, he keeps hearing them in his head saying, there must be more money, there must be more money. And when he rides his rocking horse, he's able to pick the winners, and it finally kills him.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to write about was a child who has an extraordinary ability, who is exploited by his elders. Uh, he's exploited by his mother for good reasons, and he's exploited by someone else in the book for reasons that are not good. They go from
Right.
sort of sketchy to outright terrible. And I think, again, you know, I think most stories like this have some resonance beyond the story itself. We've all known parents who exploit their children. We've all seen stories about, you know, like Mommy Dearest and that sort of thing,
Mhm.
about parents who do that. So I had a lot of fun with Later, and I
Yeah.
hope it shows in the book. There are some things in there that I found very funny, but also very scary, and it has a relationship to a book I wrote called It.
Yeah. Yeah. I recommend it. Everybody run right out and get it. Speaking of, people and bad things happening, I would like to circle back to that question of good and evil. And the second part of my question, if your perception of good and evil and particularly the way people deal with it, I don't know if you didn't answer it because you didn't want to answer it or if we just got off
No,
track.
but it's big, and
Yeah.
it's big. And after all these years and all these books, I haven't entirely, to my own satisfaction, I have not solved the issue. There are two kinds of evil, supposedly. There's inside evil that's in us, and then there's outside evil that seems to me to be a lot more comforting. That's the evil that we think of as supernatural. That's when you say to yourself, Reagan in The Exorcist has been possessed by a demon from outside, from somewhere
Right.
outside, and it isn't a case of she's got a psychological problem, you know.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
ultimately, you know, I sometimes think that long after I'm dead and forgotten, people will remember Pennywise the clown. I really think that maybe Pennywise is going to join the pantheon along with Frankenstein's monster and Bela Lugosi as Dracula and Lon Chaney as the Wolfman, because we remember our villains, but also because, you know, Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street, Jason maybe, Michael Myers, all those boogeymen. But the thing is, ultimately, I think Pennywise is uh, comforting because he's from outside. We understand when we read that book. We get involved with the characters. We want the characters to turn out okay. Uh, but we understand that Pennywise is from another universe, he's from another dimension or whatever. but he's not really real. He's not a real character. And yet at the same time, in a book like it, that's the dichotomy. The book begins with something that actually happened. I fictionalized it, but
Yeah.
there are a couple of guys who hassle two inoffensive gay men who aren't doing anything to them, and one of them gets tossed over a bridge and killed. And that's inside evil. That's something that's inside. And I've never really I've never really settled in my own mind if there is such a thing as outside evil, and I've never really settled in my mind what inside evil is. I I sometimes think of something that a friend of mine said back in the 60s. Lyndon Johnson was president, and there was a terrible, he was good in some ways, but he was unable to leave Vietnam. He just couldn't do it, and he kept expanding the war and expanding the war. And young men kept going over there and dying or being horribly wounded, and what was it all for? Really, not for anything. And in 1968, Lyndon Johnson went on television and he said, "I am not going to run for president, for your president again." And my friend said, "I saw it leave him at that moment. I saw whatever it was that had driven him on and on and on leave him at that moment." There's the question of people like Ted Bundy. I think of Ted Bundy as a purely evil person. And he killed more women and tortured them than anybody will ever know. And I think when he was executed, that was one of the few cases where I thought that the execution was justified to get rid of something that was there. But whatever was evil in him, by that time, that couldn't be caged. That couldn't be kept in a prison, and it couldn't be electrocuted. It was gone. So maybe the the clearest expression of my concern with evil. I wrote a book called Desperation, and in it there's a little boy uh, who says, "Well, if all this has happened, if my parents have been killed, if all these terrible things have happened, then God is cruel." And I believe that God is cruel. If there is such a creature, such a being, he stands aside. And one of the other characters says, "Well, yes, but if you believe that God is omnipotent and all powerful, then he's also good. He's sort of everything." And I left it at that. So it's a difficult question.
Well, I think you have a wonderful metaphor in The Stand for good, for making the right decision and the wrong decision, because you have Mother Abigail static, and people have to choose to move toward her. While Randall Flagg is the walking dude, he's always right behind your shoulder, ready to, coming to find you to make you do the wrong thing. And I think, to me, that's a beautiful metaphor for, the easy decision is often to do the wrong thing, right? And that's right there, or coming up on you. It'll find you, where you have to seek out the right answer. And I think it's a beautiful metaphor for this idea of good and evil.
Well, the character who really has to make a choice there is Harold Lauder.
Oh,
Harold has a chance to rise above his previous nerdy and unpleasant self. There comes a point where he's on body detail in Boulder, and somebody claps him. Teddy Wyzak claps him on the. I know Teddy Wyzak because I played him in the first miniseries.
yeah.
He claps him on the shoulder and says, "Good day, Hawk." And Harold says, "Can he be talking to me, calling me Hawk?" And he has a choice. But in the end, Harold consciously chooses to do evil. He says, I can't simply walk away and reject my old self. all the injuries and all the times that I was pushed down and made fun of and insulted, all those things cry out to stay what you are. And so
Yeah.
the last thing that he says before he blows up the free zone basically is, I do this of my own free will.
Harold broke my heart. I kept, the first time I read it, I kept thinking. Now, speaking of The Stand, the miniseries, which I
Right.
loved, and your son Owen was co-producer, right, or executive
Yes, he
producer.
was.
So you wrote the 9th episode, right? And you gave Franny an ending to her story. So can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to do that? I particularly yeah, connect with Franny when you describe her as having that I want
Mhm.
furrow between her brow. That's me, you know.
My mother
Um,
had that line too, and I got it. I inherited it from her. I want.
yeah, yeah. So, but can you tell us about why you felt you wanted to give Franny more space?
Well, you know, Josh Boone, who produced, created that, more or less got it going. In the end, he moved away from the production, and Benjamin Cavell took over. But Josh is a young filmmaker who is also a big fan of my work, and he's extremely intelligent. He's read a lot. He's read a lot of interviews that I don't even remember giving me at the time. And at some point, he read that I had never been satisfied with the ending, that I'd always been tempted to write one more episode of the story where Franny falls down a well on the way
Yeah,
back to Maine. And he remembered that and he said, will you write that for the show? And it was hard for me to say no because not only was Owen producing it, but he was a vital part of the writer's room, and he wrote uh, co-wrote 2 episodes and
mhm,
solo wrote, I think, episode 7 where they're walking to Vegas, and he did a great
yeah,
job. And I wanted to work with Owen, and I wanted to work with
mhm,
Josh too. So
right,
I said, well, Josh, I can do this, but it's not going to be very long. It's going to be about 35, 40 minutes. That's it. And it's not really an episode of TV. And he said, well, don't worry about that. It's streaming. And we can handle that. You know, he was going to do anything to do it. So I said, well, all right, I'll write it. You may not like it, but he loved it. He directed it. And they ended up taking my episode and combining it with a few things like Franny having her baby and the baby being sick and stuff like that. So it actually did make a pretty good episode.
I enjoyed it very much. I felt you did her justice there.
Well, good.
Um,
I mean, there were things about the show that I absolutely loved. I loved Harold, and I loved Alexander Skarsgård as Randall Flagg. Uh, and I loved the woman who played Franny. I thought that she grew and grew and grew into the part. Uh, I wasn't necessarily crazy about the Las Vegas scenes. A review called it uh, "The Stands Las Vegas is where nuance goes to die," and it was kind of a Fredericks of Hollywood vision
yeah,
of Vegas, and I wasn't really crazy about that because I'd seen it more as a working class place, where
yeah,
evil was just sort of like the Nazis. After a while, that sort of gigantic evil becomes par for the course. That's one of the horrible things about it.
yeah. I think I tweeted when I watched one of the episodes. I said, and I like most. I'm glad because I thought I was like crazy looking at the Vegas thing, going, no, 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 too much. But I think they ought to have somebody from Maine anytime they're filming dialogue, so that we don't get Franny saying Arano instead of Arano.
Yeah,
I almost fell out of my chair, but
nobody recognizes it but us. But
I know,
I
I know.
remember doing a Storm of the Century, which is one of
Yeah,
my favorite miniseries. It's an original one, and I like the way that turned out. And I liked everybody who was in there, but I remember going to Casey Shimashko, who played the deputy, and uh, and I'm saying, that main accent that you're doing is not really working. You don't. Most people from Maine don't even have that accent. So you could get away with that. No, he couldn't be convinced. So.
Yeah. It's a little thing,
Oh,
but
sort of, you know, we got sort of like Maine, yeah.
yeah. Oh God, yes. I'm going to throw something at you from left field. Is there a book or a story that you have always wanted to write but have not been able to? And if so, what's stopping you?
Well, I don't think there's anything, and part of the reason why I say that is because if I can't actually write a story, it has a tendency to drop out
Yeah.
after a while. Uh, some stories scream to be written. I wrote a story. I've got a novel that I'm working on, and it's tough. This is a tough book to write, and so the way that I deal with things that are tough is to kind of put my head down and bull on. But this particular story was saying, write me or I'm going to die. And I'm really too good to die. So I took a couple of days off and I wrote a story. And so there are some that scream to be written, and there are some that just kind of like fall through the cracks. If you don't write them, they go away. So I just say to myself, well, that wasn't a good story anyway.
Right. That makes sense. Let me think. What else? Oh, my students will kill me if I don't ask you about night surf. So, for those who haven't read it, it's I can't remember which collection it was in, but it's sort of
precursor of The Stand.
It's precursor of The Stand. But the lead character, the narrator, Benny. This is why I have to write down names. He's complaining about his girlfriend. So it's the end of the world, and they're teenagers, and she's becoming more clingy and whiny and more weepy, and he keeps talking about her getting fat. Is she pregnant in the story?
I don't remember.
Okay, fair enough. That's how I
wrote that one. I wrote that one in college, and I barely remember it at all. So
yeah. We I pair that with a couple other things, and then I pull that on my students. It's and then in home delivery, this is another one that I really like. Maddie, were you thinking about the possible underlying horror of the story, that her baby could be born dead and a zombie?
Yes, I thought.
Okay.
I remember that story very well, and I thought to myself, okay, when I write this story, what's going to happen is there was an anthology by Craig Spector and John Skip. They wanted to do an anthology of stories about the living dead. And at that time, I had this idea for a story, and I thought, good, I'm going to write it, home delivery. And I thought to myself, the end of this story is Maddie's baby dies and chews its way out.
Oh, I knew it.
And I couldn't do it. I couldn't
Yeah.
do it. I liked her too much. So,
Yeah.
you know, although let me just modify that a little bit by saying that, and I'm talking to you creative writers out there now, that it's like Scott Landon says in Lisi's story, there's always a struggle between the writer and the story, and at some point the writer has to let go and let the story tell itself. Now, I didn't say to myself, oh, I'm going to let Maddie live. She just lived in the story. And I never said to myself that Todd Bowden was going to die in the little Ford Pinto in Cujo. He died. That's all. He died. And people would write me letters and say, how could you do that? And I said, I didn't do it. The story did it. I didn't know. I thought all along that he would live, but he didn't.
Yeah.
You have to be true to the story, particularly if you're writing fantasy, if you're writing stories of the supernatural. Nobody will believe any of this shit. unless you tell the truth about the characters.
Yeah. And that's an interesting, that idea about people believing it, because I think I want to get the quotation right. You once said that you were drawn to Richard Matheson because he was, quote, putting the horror in places I could relate to, unquote, everyday locations and situations. So when you started writing, did you have that in mind? Because that's what, to me, that's one of the things that you're so great at is these everyday situations, right?
You know, people will say to me, "Did you read Lovecraft?" Yes, I did. When I was a teenager, I read Lovecraft. Did you like Lovecraft? I liked some of the stories. I liked The Color Out of Space. I liked The Rats in the Walls. I liked The Dunwich Horror. So some of them I liked. The man couldn't write dialogue to save his life. And some of the stuff is just prolix. They'll say, "Did you like Edgar Allan Poe?" And I'll say, as a young man, The Mask of the Red Death, The Pit and the Pendulum, uh, some of the other ones, Telltale Heart. Uh, the what's the story about the guy who walls his friend up? For the love of God, Montressor.
The Cask of Amontillado.
Cask of Amontillado. And I love those, but a lot of the other stuff, no, not particularly. But I found Robert Bloch, who wrote a horror novel about a motel, a roadside motel. He wrote a horror novel about a man who fetishes a scarf, and he ends up strangling women with a scarf. Uh, Richard Matheson wrote a book called I Am Legend, which has been made into movies a few times, but none of them equal the book. Robert Neville lives in a suburban tract development. We all know it. We've all seen it. And he makes steaks out of baseball bats. We can relate to that. Ray Bradbury wrote about Greentown, Illinois, and he wrote about carnivals and that sort of thing. He wrote about stories about ordinary small town life, but he would add that element. Charles Beaumont was another one. There are a few other ones that I can think of too, but Matheson was the best. Matheson was the best because he knew how to reach a peak of intensity and stay there. You know, there's really, the classic story is Duel, about
Love
the
that.
man who is chased by the truck for no reason. And the Spielberg film is terrific too.
Yeah.
It reaches that point of intensity and it just drills there. So.
That, yes, I loved Duel is one we watch. My husband and I watch a lot together, like
Yeah.
at least once a year, because it holds up. There was something else that came to mind. This is an odd question as well too, but do you ever miss owning WZON?
I still do.
Yeah. Oh, you
Yeah.
do?
Yeah. It's become WKIT.
Oh.
ZON is now kind of what you'd call a robo station. It's very tough to, you know, I don't want to make money from the radio business. Anybody who does is absolutely out of their mind. You can't make money from the radio business, but you can hope to break even or stay close to it. We had a great year in 2020. Nobody else did, but we did because there was a lot of money that came in from political campaigns. So
Yeah.
that helped out a little bit, but it was, thank God for it because everything else dried up completely. You know, the advertising dollars. It was such a terrible year in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I have all these like random questions that my students have asked me. Do you think that you will? I mean, you've done the great pandemic novel, but do you think that you will write about the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, not like metaphorically, but specifically?
No, I probably won't. You know, it's interesting that you would mention that because the best book about it was published in March of last year, just when this thing started to get going. And this guy saw the whole thing coming. The book is called The End of October, and I can't recommend it highly enough. The writer's name is Lawrence. Look it up on your computer, or I will real quick. Lawrence The end of October. It's by Lawrence Wright, Wright. And he got everything right. Everything. Where it starts, how it spreads, the inability of people to accept it because it means such huge changes in life. And at the end of it, you talk about great last lines of books, and it gives nothing away. The last line of the end of October is, "We did it to ourselves." And I love that. I love that line. But you know, the thing that's interesting is what happens with writing stories when writers sit down to write about the pandemic. It's very difficult to see what's going to happen. I remember when the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain just sort of collapsed, and there were people in literary circles who were saying, well, that's it for the spy genre. There won't be any more spy stories. John Le Carre might as well retire. And of course, you know, nothing like that happened because there were still spy stories to be written. But with this thing, this is on a different level. Society itself has changed the way that we behave. The only thing that I've been able to write about it so far was I did write one thing that said in New York City at the height of the pandemic. And I was there for a film shoot that finally got shut down. But, you know, the streets weren't crowded the way I remember New York streets being. And a lot of the people were wearing masks. Everybody was wearing a mask at that time. And I thought to myself, you know, I want to write a story about this one guy who is walking up Madison Avenue with his mask on, you know, and every now and then he sees somebody and he tips him a wink, just a little wink, you know, and they wink back at him. And finally he comes to this hotel and they're going to have a meeting of some kind of organization. And the place is full of people and they're all wearing their masks. And he says, this is the perfect time and the perfect place to invade because the one thing we can't change is under the mask. And he takes it off and all these green tentacles.
Oh!
You know, and they all do the same thing because that's the one thing. They are aliens who are using masks. But beyond that, I've got a book coming out this summer called Billy Summers. And it was set originally in the year 2020, in the summer and the fall of 2020. And there was a character in there, a minor character, who talks about, well, we inherited some money, we're going to go on a cruise. And I thought to myself, you know, I got a problem here because all the cruises are shut down and none of these things make sense. So I slugged everything back to 2019. I've seen that happen a lot of times. I've seen a few novels, maybe you have, where the pandemic is sort of, people are tiptoeing up to it and trying to decide how to handle it.
There's that HBO film too about the couple in I haven't seen it yet. The couple in quarantine, Anne Hathaway, guy's name, and they're going to pull off a heist, and that's like the first film I've seen that dealt directly with that kind of thing. It's hard to do.
It's interesting. I feel like noses and mouths are going to become the new erogenous zones, you know, because they're covered territory, and when you take off your mask, it's a way of saying, "Come here, baby." Because you can't really feature a love scene where people are kissing with their masks on.
No.
It's not going to work.
No. I could just keep asking you questions all day, but the chat's exploding. So if it's okay with you, we'll take a few questions, Q&A from the chat. Okay, and Joanne, you're going to moderate that? You're going to read the questions for us?
Happy to do that. And lots of different questions and comments for you to react to, Stephen and Wendy. So one comes from a parent, speaking of the radio, says, when I was a student, at St. Joseph's College. In a communications class, there was an old-fashioned radio show that they had to make relative to the mist, and they played it on WSJB FM. So this student is very excited about the fact that you're talking about the radio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Radio drama. I remember the very end of it. I'm old enough to remember shows on the radio like Johnny Dollar and Suspense and Gunsmoke, where everything was done through the hearing. And I really think, you know, they talk about how Toledo Steel is a lost art, and radio drama is a lost art too. People have lost the ability to just hear drama and hear the sound effects. There's such a tendency, every now and then somebody will give it a shot, and it's usually like a recorded book.
So Stephen, this is a question do you feel with advancing technology, this comes from Ruth, that you'll be able to better provide suspense, or do you prefer the older, less technology fear factors in the older movies? Example, would you advocate any of your older made movies to be made again now with more modern technology? And this woman says, thanks so much. She is a parent of a graduate, 2012.
Well, some of the movies have been remade. Pet Sematary was remade. I've lived just long enough to see these things come around again. The Stand has been remade. And when we did The Stand originally, almost everything was done on location. There were 110 different locations, from New York to Utah to Las Vegas itself. And we had to do that, whereas there are locations in the new version of The Stand, but with technology like computer graphic imaging and the special effects that are so prevalent nowadays, there's less that has to be done that way. So I think there are stories that are, you know, in process for movies that are going to use a lot of the modern technology that didn't exist in the old days. But it's hard to tell exactly what's going to happen. One of the things that interests me when you talk about horror and suspense are the whole virtual reality thing, where you actually put on goggles and you're in that world. I think that there's possibility there for people to actually have full-fledged heart attacks or strokes if it was scary enough. I mean, the thing that's the closest to that now that we certainly didn't have when I was a kid is IMAX.
Okay, so another comment from Cheryl says, I was so blown away with The Outsider, but The Institute is my favorite book. I cried over the ending. So she wanted you to know that.
Well, good. I like people who react strongly, that have emotional reactions. That's great. That's great. Yeah.
And Amy wants to know, Stephen, do you remember your last rejection letter, and what project was that for?
I've had several stories rejected by the New Yorker that have found homes in other places. Their standards are very high, and I never quibbled with that. I never had a resentment about it. But every now and then you do run into that sort of thing. And there are less markets for fiction, short fiction. Every year, more of the little magazines disappear. Magazines like Tin House and Virginia Quarterly. I think Virginia Quarterly is still there, but I think it's on life support. So it can be tough. It can be a tough thing. And yeah, let's leave it at that.
Okay. And Mary, who is on our Alumni Association board, says that I read Bag of Bones and finished it one late night and was afraid to climb up the dark stairs to my bedroom. I felt like someone was behind me and I ran all the way up.
Good. Good. That's a good thing. I like that.
And will there be more co-authored books like The Beauties with your son?
Yeah. Uh, Writing that with Owen was a one-off, I think, but it was a fantastic experience. I've collaborated. There's a collaboration coming. Okay. Uh, I wrote a story called Gwendy's Button Box, or I wrote half of that story, and then I got roadblocked. Doesn't always happen, but it happens from time to time. And I just set it aside. And a good friend of mine, Richard Chismar, who's a writer and also publishes a magazine called Cemetery Dance, said, if you ever want to collaborate, uh, I'd be willing to try that. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, Rich, here's the story, see what you can do with it. So I sent him Gwendy's Button Box, and he finished it. He actually did. And then we sat down and we kind of went over it together and tweaked it a little bit here and there, and it was published in a little volume as Gwendy's Button Box. Little girl finds or is given a box that has all these buttons on it, and when you push one, there's different colors for different continents, and if you push one, something happens there that's always bad. It might be good to start with, but it would turn out being bad, and she has the responsibility for this box. And at the end of the story, the man who gave her the box comes back and takes it from her. And I thought, well, that's good. That's the end of it. But then Rich said, would you mind if I told a story about Gwendy as a grown-up? And I said, no, that would be fine. Let's see what you can do. And he wrote this wonderful thing called Gwendy's Magic Feather. And Gwendy is a grown-up. She's still living in Castle Rock, Maine. But she has become both a novelist and a politician, which seem like strange bedfellows, but it's happened several times in real life, and he did a great job. So that book was published, and some time went by, and it was what I was saying before. Good ideas stay. At least they stay for a long time, and if they get away, you always feel like, damn, I let that thing go. So I had an idea for Gwendy's third act. And so I went to Rich this time and said, Richard, would you like to do one more? And he said, absolutely, I'm on board. So we wrote a full-length novel that's called Gwendy's Final Task, and it comes out next year. So.
Oh, wow, that's exciting. That's
I like to collaborate once in a while, but it's tough because you have to deal with somebody else's ideas and somebody else's artistic vision. So it's a tough thing. Maybe the toughest collaboration that I ever did was I wrote a musical with John Mellencamp called Ghost Brothers of Darkland County, and I wrote the book, he wrote the music, and John's a wonderful guy, but he can also be a guy who has got a short temper, and I love him. Not everybody does, but it was an interesting collaboration.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. And Mandy wants to share that she, first learned to read at the age of 8, and the first book of yours was Salem's Lot. Very, very lucky that mom never tried to shield her from any type of that kind of literature. And some of her favorite Stephen King's are The Long Walk, The Talisman, and The Tower, Dark Tower series. Question for you is, not only horror writer, but horror lover, what is your favorite horror movie that you've seen during the pandemic?
That I've seen during the pandemic. I think probably the best one that I've seen during the pandemic, don't hold me to this, but the last movie I saw in a theater before everything closed down was The Invisible Man, with Elizabeth Moss as the main character. And we talked a little bit about how horror has subtexts, and it has something, when it works really well, it always has something to do with the real world, with real world problems. And that was a story about domestic abuse. And it worked really well. So I really like that. Was there anything else that I've seen this year? The pandemic year? I don't think so. I like Bird Box on Netflix a lot, but I don't think that was the pandemic year. Um, oh, what is the movie about the kids that are out in the desert and they hear messages from outer space? They're at a little isolated radio station. The Shadow of Night.
Yeah, it's something like that. Yeah. Oh, what was that?
Come on, Wendy.
Yeah, well, as I said, whenever I teach, I have to have the list of titles and authors and stuff in front of me.
That was a darn good movie.
Yeah. Shadows in the Night? No, I don't remember.
See if someone's answering for us.
Yeah, somebody must know out there.
The Vast of Night.
What was it?
The Vast of Night.
The Vast of the Night.
That's it.
Yeah. Interesting movie. And you know what I saw this year for the first time? My New Year's resolution was to watch one movie from every year from 1961 to 2021. And so I'm going through that steadily. It's interesting. I got up to, I think, 1975 before I heard the F word in a movie. That was in Network. But I saw for the first time Eraserhead, the David Lynch film, which is very disturbing indeed. So I guess that would count.
Okay, sounds great. So what is your favorite story that you have written and favorite story that you have read? Two different questions.
The favorite one I've written, the short story, there's one called The Reach, which was retitled, I think, it was published in Yankee magazine. It was called Did the Dead Sing? And my brother-in-law, who was in the Coast Guard, told me a story. You know, the Reach is like an area of water between two pieces of land, usually between the mainland and an island, and it very rarely freezes. And he told me this story about an old woman whose lifelong ambition was to walk across from the mainland to an island. And I have an island that I write about called Little Tall. So I wrote a story that incorporated that basic idea. That's my favorite story. Of the novels, I would say my favorite is Lisey's story, which has a special place in my heart because I always wanted to write a story about creativity and how a marriage, a good marriage, can anchor a creative person to this world. And so I wrote the book, and then a number of years later, probably 15, 16 years later, I decided to write spec screenplays for a miniseries. This was the era of streaming, and things are so much more open. You know, it's like the Wild West out there. There's Netflix, there's Hulu, there is Stars, Peacock, and then there's one called Apple Plus. And they bought it. And it's been made. There was some difficulty when the pandemic closed down, and we were shut down for most of the summer. But we finally got back together and finished, and it stars Julianne Moore as Lisey and Clive Owen as Scott Landon, and it has a good cast. Joan Allen, who was in A Good Marriage, and Jennifer Jason Leigh, who was in Dolores Claiborne, the film version of that. So it's a little bit like a reuniting thing, and it's a great chance for me to see that story turned into a film. And the great thing about streaming is that you have room for the story to spread in a novelistic way. I love that, and I love the chance to do that. I mean, movies are great if they're a certain kind of a movie, but when you talk about adapting a long novel to a movie, it's like when you're trying to take everything you own on vacation and you have to just sit on the suitcase to get everything in there. And a lot of times it bursts open anyway because you just try to stuff in too much. So streaming is a great thing, and I enjoyed the chance to adapt my favorite book for a TV show. It's going to be on Apple Plus this summer in June, starting in June.
Oh, that's great. We'll have to see that. You know, to that point, one question from Stephanie is, have you ever been disappointed on how a movie or a miniseries from one of your stories was produced, created, ended up? Anything disappoint you about
Yes.
your art? You want to share anything about that, Stephen?
No, because my mother told me as a kid, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. I can say this, I've been extremely fortunate in a lot of the adaptations from Carrie onward. Carrie, Misery, Storm of the Century, of course, Stand By Me was one that really pleased me. Both parts seemed to me to be really honorable adaptations of the source material. And The Shawshank Redemption. I got a story about that. Some of the people listening in will have heard it, but I never get tired of telling it. And I was in a Publix market down here, and I guess it was probably a Wednesday or Thursday because my wife would let me shop for the little stuff. You know, she would never trust me with a full-fledged shop, but if she needed like tea bags or some kind of utensil, she would send me to the market. And I came around the corner, and there was a woman coming the other way. She had a Florida tan. She was an elderly woman and she was riding in one of those carts, the special handicap type things that are like scooters. And she took one look at me and she said, "I know who you are. You're Stephen King." Yes. And she said, "You write all those scary stories, and that's okay for some people, but I like more uplifting things, like that movie Shawshank Redemption." And I said, "I wrote that." And she said, "No, you didn't." Just
it's like
wasn't a place for that in her philosophy.
Okay, well, great. Let's see, we've got lots of questions coming here. So one question is, I was born and raised in Maine. I recently moved back from 6 years in LA, and I'm a screenwriter, and I'm attempting my first novel. People always say you have to live in a big city to be successful, but you have to live in Maine your whole life. Have you ever felt the need to live somewhere else, or do you feel Maine is what fuels your work? Maine is where my heart is, and I'm using your novels to help generate my first novel.
Well, I hope that this person has good luck with their novel and stick to it. The only way that you can do it is one word at a time, one page at a time, one chapter at a time, and eventually the darn thing gets done if you don't lose your courage. I wrote a couple of books based in Maine. Carrie was set in basically in my hometown of Lisbon Falls, and Salem's Lot, which was the second book, was set in the Cumberland County area because it was so quiet at the time that I grew up. And I thought to myself, well, if all of Cumberland County turned into a vampire playground, nobody would notice because nobody lives there. Well, they do now, but at that time they didn't. So I came to my wife after those two books were published, and I said, I think that we ought to go somewhere else, and I ought to get some other feel for a book, some other locale. And she said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't have the slightest idea." So she got the Rand McNally Road Atlas and held it open in the middle to the map of the United States and said, "Close your eyes and point." So I closed my eyes and I pointed, and my finger came down on Colorado. And we moved there, and we found a little house down the street from the King Supermarket. And there were a lot of people there who worked for IBM. That's when I found out that IBM really stands for I've been moved. And, and so I wrote a couple of books there, The Shining, because we spent some time in Estes Park at a spooky old hotel called the Stanley. I almost said the Overlook. The Overlook was the name of my hotel. And then I wrote The Stand, where a lot of it was set in Boulder, which is where we were living. But in the end, I had to come back to Maine because I felt strangled in the middle of the country. I felt claustrophobic. There was no water. I mean, we did go to a Democratic picnic that was supposed to be at a lake. It was a friggin' cow pond, is what it was, you know. And the company was good, but it wasn't really what you'd call a main lake. It wasn't Sebago or Long Lake. It wasn't any of it wasn't certainly wasn't the Atlantic Ocean. So we came back to Maine, and we've lived there ever since. I come down to Florida in the winter because I just can't stand the cold anymore. But most of the year, we live in Maine, and a lot of the stories have been set there, and that's fine. Because the locale doesn't matter as much as the writer's ability to take himself seriously, to get in a groove, a daily groove, a time when you expect the creative machinery to turn on. I don't think creative juices is really right. It's a machine, and you turn it on at a certain time of day, and you run it until it starts to get overheated, and then you turn it off and do something else for a while. Does that help? Does that make any sense at all?
It does.
None of this makes any sense, does it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Joanne, I think I have one final question for Steve, if that's okay, if I can use my prerogatives here.
Well, I'm kind of getting worn down a little bit here.
I thought.
And
yeah.
Yeah.
So going back to that Dick Cavett program, as I said on YouTube, you get have this wonderful quotation where somebody asked, those, I can't tell you the number of times I've seen you as somebody says, what scares you? And I'm like, read the books, right? Mm-hmm. But you said about writing horror and scary things, quote, you search out the things that scare you the most and try to get rid of them by writing about them. Have you gotten rid of what scares you the most?
No, I don't think so. You find new things that scare you as you get old. I mean, when I was a kid, I was afraid that there might be something in my closet. I was afraid that something might be under my bed. As a young writer, I wrote about those things. Of course, some of that stays. I still don't really like my feet out of the covers when it's dark because I just, go sue me if you want to, but I don't want that. I don't want the closet door to be open when I go to sleep at night. But most of those fears go. I think that as an older person, I've become more politically aware. It's in some of the books. I try not to get up on a soapbox or a pedestal and flog a hobby horse. There's quite enough of that on Twitter and Facebook and the other places. So if it plays a part in the story, it's like sex. If the sex is important to the story, then okay. If it's not important to the story, or if the politics aren't important to the story, then not okay. I think the thing that scares me most now as an older person is the pandemic and what's going to happen as a result of the pandemic, what's going to change, what isn't going to change. And of course, when you get to be into your 70s, you start to worry about the cheese slipping off your cracker, Alzheimer's, senility, dementia, all those things. So hopefully that won't happen. But as a writer who has used his imagination all my life, I have a morbid awareness of writers who've gone down with that. So.
Well, Stephen, I cannot tell you enough how grateful we are that you did this, how grateful I am. And that I get a chance to thank you for really, I mean, that meeting with that conversation with you was a pivotal point in my life. It really, looking back on it, I can see that you were a teacher, how patient you were in talking to me. And so a chance to thank you publicly was really important to me.
Porter's drugstore up there.
Porter's drugstore. Yeah, Porter's
That's
drugstore. Yeah.
And Porter's, yeah.
Yeah. So I just appreciate you doing this so very much.
Well, great. Thank you. And we had a good conversation and I enjoyed it.
Great.
Thank you, Stephen. Listen, I want to share with you that there are dozens and dozens of comments. We are going to print them and we're going to send them off to you. You do need to hear all that people are saying about you and your work. We're so very proud that you're with us in Maine and so very grateful for all the wonderful support you've given St. Joseph's College. You visited us back in 1976, so we've got to get you back on campus. We look forward to that. I have just a few closing remarks for the audience. This is Front Row with the Faculty. It is held every second and fourth Wednesday of each month. Next Front Row with the Faculty series is going to be March 24th, and we have our Professor Emeritus, Michael Conley, who actually posed a question to you when it started, who will be speaking. So I hope we all can join in for him. And I wouldn't be doing my job correctly if I didn't take a moment, if you don't mind, Stephen, where we have 350 plus people, to say that St. Joseph's College's annual Day of Giving is March 19th. So if you're so inclined, please go on our website. We have a goal. Our goal is really participation. That's most important. We want people to get to know our college, our community. And so we hope you do come to visit us when you can, but certainly if you can support us on March 19th, we'd appreciate that. This is the campus. It's absolutely magnificent and it's yours. You can visit it anytime. Thank you so much, Stephen. Bless you for all your good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Wendy,
thank you all for coming. I'm now going to go feed my dog.
Okay. Feel better.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy.